Welcome to Leaders of Tomorrow, India's only daily television platform for small businesses. Over the past 7 years, we've understood what matters most to you, the entrepreneur. And in year 8, we're taking head-on two of your most pressing concerns, that of funding and mentoring. I'm Sananda Jayaseelan. Tonight, we're breaking down budget expectations for you, the MSME, SME and startup entrepreneur, to talk about what you can look forward to in Budget 2020. Will it be a make or break budget? Can and will the budget be able to address the slowdown in the economy? And also, what can it do to address sentiment? All of that are the questions I'm going to be posing to our panelists tonight. Let me quickly introduce them. First and foremost, joining us in studio, Dr. Brinda Jagirdar, independent economist, Madan Sabnavis, Chief Economist, Care Ratings, and Sunil Alag, MD of SKA Advisors. So the big questions we're asking tonight is, of course, can the budget and will the budget address and fix the slowdown that's happening in the economy? What will the budget do when it comes to sentiment in addressing and fixing sentiment and consumer sentiment and spending sentiment? And like some experts are pointing out, is this going to be a make or break budget, and how much should we be focusing on that? Before we attempt to answer some of these questions, at least, I do know that we only have 20 minutes. Let me very quickly probably come to my right and start with you, Madan, and ask you, if there was one wish list that you had to present to the finance minister ahead of Budget 2020, what would it be?
See, in terms of a wish list that is beyond the scope of being practical, I would say that the government should go in for a higher fiscal deficit and go in for certain direct expenditure, which actually adds to overall demand in the country and forges strong backward linkages with other industries. So therefore, I would say increasing the fiscal deficit by, say, 1% of GDP. So if I'm talking of 3.3% last year, let's say it's going to be 4.3% this year, is something which would definitely be a little more decisive than the plethora of other measures which are normally announced and take time to work out.
Okay. Dr. Jagirdar, if I was to ask you one thing.
The main thing to address the slowdown. So slowdown, I think, has happened mainly because investment has been slowing down for the last 10 years, and even the savings has been coming down. So the investment GDP ratio from something like about, say, 40%, it has come down to about 30%. And similarly, the savings rate also, saving GDP ratio has also come down over the last 10 years. So this persistent slowdown in investment and savings needs to be addressed. That I think is the top priority, to stop the slowdown in the economy and get it reviving, and to revive the economy and get it going again.
Okay, so both the economists on the panel, of course, have picked revival of the economy and investment really as the one wish list they want to present to Nirmala Sitharaman, if they could. From the consumer side, would you pick the sentiment side, of course, and talk about the one thing that you think has to be fixed?
No, I said this in the July budget when it was presented, and I say it again. The great swing that has taken place on the supply side has to be balanced. Right now, my only wish is the demand side has to be looked at. Who are the people who are going to buy the products that the industry is creating? Who are the people who are going to spend the money? There's very little done for them in the last 6 months. And my budget would focus on that this time, because the swing and bring about the balance in demand and supply.
Okay, let's quickly look at the headlines. The RBI, of course, lowering its outlook for the fiscal 2019 to 2020. We are at the 6-year low, looking at what's happening globally, of course. There's so much that's really going on as far as the economy is concerned. The IMF is talking about a continued recession and a continued slowdown. India may look good compared to what's happening globally, but that doesn't mean India has really escaped the worst of what is really happening globally. How much of this do you think is something that the small businesses are seeing personally impacting their businesses? What do you think they should keep in mind, not just for the budget, but we're sitting, of course, at the beginning of 2020. For the rest of the year, how much of that do you think is going to play out? What should they really keep in mind? This is open to the entire panel.
Can I just add, of the small businesses are looking for liquidity. As far as I'm concerned, they don't have the money. The banks are not willing to lend to them because they don't have enough of collateral, as you would call it. And therefore, the banks have the money. The small scale doesn't have it. And unless that changes, what are they going to do? I mean, the small scale guys are producing more or less for local areas. They are not the big industrialists. And therefore, they are better powered to do that generation of demand, at least in that area, which will then add up to the national demand. And therefore, my thing is the small scale industry, the banks have to now get back and not have this fear of spending or giving loans, which is somehow arrived that if they give a loan, they will come under CBI and they will come under everybody else. The Prime Minister is saying it won't, but you have to trust the thing, because ultimately at the end of it, there's a huge gap between the government will and its implementation. And unless the whole bureaucracy and the government moves in one direction, I don't see it happening.
Okay, very pertinent point raised. All small businesses that have spoken with us leading up to the budget, we've been speaking to entrepreneurs to say, what do you want to see changing? Over the course of the year, whether it's budget or not, liquidity has been the biggest concern. The government, a couple of things that they've announced. One is, of course, looking at the NPA situation. Sentiment to be improved and therefore spending to be improved, and that's something you were talking about. Looking at setting up perhaps a stressed assets fund, and also in some sense maybe encouraging more banks to lend to smaller businesses, whether other businesses are receiving those funds or not. Do you think all of that will address the problem to both of you?
You know, yes, this definitely funding is a big issue for the small scale, but also one thing that the government has done is now insisted that all the big companies should now register themselves on TREDS, so that the small companies get their payment back on time. So I think that's a very important issue. But more than that, it's the small companies, they are just being incentivized to stay small. I think we should encourage them to grow and become part of global supply chains. There are some small companies who produce for the global, I mean, who are very, very good at technology and who have been producing niche commodities. We should encourage them to become part of the global supply chain. So take advantage of size and take advantage of technology. I think these two are as important as liquidity for the small scale company.
So in fact, I think I have 2 points to make here. I think one thing is to say that we need liquidity to be provided to the small scale sector. But we should also remember that we should be careful that we don't create another huge pile of NPAs, because I think we already have this dispensation which was made during demonetization time, saying that we won't treat your NPAs as NPAs. This move saying up to March 20, we won't treat it as NPAs. So I think this is what we have played up. I think earlier it was for the large industry, today we're saying for the SMEs. So while it's one thing to say push liquidity, I think there should always be a case of saying you should qualify for it, which means that internally you have to make sure that your governance structures are good. I think that's a problem which lots of SMEs have. You have to make sure that their models are viable, because today we've had a situation of saying just because I have so many incentives being given, it makes a lot of sense for me to take the money, let me start an enterprise. Like for example, it's worldwide known that around 80% of the startups actually flop after a couple of years. Yeah. So I take the money and then it becomes an NPA. Okay, it may be a small quantity, but when it really piles up, it could create a major problem for the banking system. Sure. So I think we need to go slow. We should be judicious on it. We should not be pushing forward. Everything takes time, and I think the moment an SME is linked to a large company, we see an overall economic slowdown, you also tend to get affected. Okay. So I think this kind of stage, pushing the SME, saying that because you're an SME, it's very important for the economy. We say a large part of our GDP, large part of employment is emanating from the SMEs. Yes, they are very critical for the economy, but we have to make sure that we do it in a gradual way.
We've had a couple of models, like the government saying loans up to 1 crore under 59 minutes. You have collateral-free loans. You have the government insisting that it's going to formalize, it hasn't happened yet, that large corporates have to pay their outstanding to small businesses within a certain period of time. From all of that, do you think there have been any learnings? Because that one model doesn't seem to have sort of fit in, sort of
because
and fallen
what
in place.
The government announces and what is put out in fine print are exactly the opposite.
Yes.
So, you know, whilst the Prime Minister might say, I want to do this, until somebody actually ensures implementation, I'm sure the Prime Minister can't.
So my question is just that, what is going to ensure that implementation, given that all of these schemes have been in existence for,
simplify
say,
the rules. Why do you make such complicated rules? Simplify them. Then there's nobody who can do anything with the rules.
No, in fact,
let everybody understand it.
Yeah. Sure. In fact, I think we also need to know one thing. It's easy to say that you give a loan in 59 minutes. Now, if I'm a banker, is it really possible for me to give a loan in 59 minutes? It's probably not.
Impossible.
So I think that's the major problem.
There's also the concern that an infrastructure like NPA situation could come up if you're under stress to lend and don't have the time to really sort of check paper.
Two things I would
paperwork,
say. One is that it is possible to lend under 59 minutes because companies have been doing it. Look at the NBFC. In 10 minutes, you walk into a Chroma, walk into anything, you get your loan like that. They quickly run through and they look at your the parameters, and then you are able to get it. So for certain things, it is possible, but maybe not for a big, complicated manufacturing unit, for example.
Sure. How do you ensure that implementation? What can be fixed on implementation?
So long as the rate of growth is lower than the rate of interest, it's not going to, you do whatever, it will only be band-aid.
Sure.
So
what you're saying is so right, because the ease of doing business, which is the macro thing, we might have gone up to, I think, 60 or something. But when you look at all the elements, you'll find that we are 160 in contracts. So everybody looks at when you sign a contract, you're 160. Now all the guys have to go through a long process. When you acquire land, somebody will arrive and say, all right. So even businesses who want to get in, you have to look at that in a little bit of micro analysis. Where are we weak? We are weak in all contracts. Everybody is going into court. Everybody is doing whatever there is. So that is not understood as yet, and that's very important.
One thing that most companies and most of India Inc. is looking forward to is as far as a cut on tax rates are concerned. I want to talk about the economy and what impact is likely to have on the economy with both our economists, and also to talk about then the impact on consumer sentiment if that were to happen. Are you expecting some announcements?
So I think there is a talk about the lowering of income tax rate, because I think corporate tax has already been lowered, and we have seen that the impact will not be felt immediately, but the immediate feeling is, if we talk to most companies, they will probably be using it to repay debt. They may be using it to pay a higher dividend. When there's no investment opportunity, I have surplus capacity, there's no reason why I should be investing right now. But definitely in course of time, when the economy recovers, this is going to help. Now, in terms of income tax, it's quite interesting, because if I'm going to lower the income tax rate, the question is, are we really going to spend money?
Yeah.
I think there's so much of uncertainty in terms of our own jobs, in terms of employment which is being generated, about future expectations. So I have a feeling that if you do a marginal kind of reduction in income tax rate, it won't work. Maybe a few people will be happy saying I'm saving 1,000, 2,000 rupees per annum. That doesn't really matter. So we need to give this kind of benefit to people in the higher income groups, which I don't think in this kind of a situation you'll say, look, this is against being egalitarian. We have to help the poor. How come you're helping the rich? And sometime back we were trying to put that surcharge on the super rich. Today, if I'm going to say I'm going to give benefits to them, because they're the ones who actually have the spending power.
Yeah.
We've already seen the PM Kisan scheme. Just think of a situation where I'm giving a farmer 500 rupees per month, and you have onion prices going to 150 rupees a month. You're not going to have the spending power to actually spend on so-called consumer goods.
Sure.
So I think income tax is something which we're all expecting, but to my mind, if at all it's there, it'll be very, very marginal. It's not going to be substantial.
Feasible or not feasible?
No, it is feasible.
Sure.
It is feasible, and I think it will happen also. But more than anything else, before we come to tax cutting, let's set the house in order. Earlier, the economic survey, remember last year, talked about the twin balance sheet problem.
Yeah.
Last month, the World Bank talked about a 4 balance sheet problem. So it's not just the corporate and the banks, but also the real estate and the NBFCs. So you need to fix all these before just trying to give some freebies to people.
Okay, we are going to take a very quick break on that note. On the other side, we'll continue breaking down the expectations for you, the entrepreneur, from Budget 2020. Do stay tuned. Back in just a moment. Welcome back. You're with us here on Leaders of Tomorrow tonight, breaking down the expectations from Budget 2020 for entrepreneurs. So will that fix the sentiment? What's going to drive consumer sentiment?
No, it's a little, well, it will drive it to the extent that I agree with her in saying, of course, you got to give the middle income group. Forget about the rich for the moment.
Yeah.
The middle income group, when you go on the road saying, "Hamare liye kuch nahi kiya aapne." So how do you change them to start spending money? You have to put money into the hands, and therefore I've said it over the years, fiscal deficit, allow it to, I mean, I'm not saying give it a runaway situation, but don't be so emphasizing fiscal deficit all the time. Let it go to 4.5% for 1 year. You can bring it down in the next year. Similarly, the RBI has been stuck on inflation till now. Again, you know, Keynes, which I studied in economics honors, he said 6%, 6.5% for a developing economy is never a problem. It shows growth. You're hung up on 4% inflation. Come on. So you control inflation, you control fiscal deficit, you control everything, and the guy says, I'm not going to spend. Even now, the perception will have to change. The money that is put into the hands of the middle income group, and I'm not talking, the rich have perhaps more opportunity to do whatever they want, but the middle income group will put the money away, may not even put it into the bank because they don't trust the banks anymore. So the trust deficit with the system is so high that he might even keep it at home and not spend the money because he's not sure of the future. So perception has to change, and therefore a whole deal of marketing, small efforts have to be made.
On this particular issue, I think we should also remember that the government's tax collections have definitely not been robust. We're falling short. And there's a lot of talk about the GST rates actually being increased. So here we're saying we want consumers to spend more. We've already seen that with the lowering of GST rates, the consumer has not really paid lower prices for most of the manufactured products. So today, if I'm thinking that the government is going to review a situation where I'm going to start increasing the rates, it's going to dampen consumption further.
But I think where fiscal deficit is concerned, I completely agree with Sunil that we need to look at where we are spending. The quality of fiscal deficit is important, and where we are spending and what multiplier effects the spending is going to lead to, because we need the government to now crowd in the private sector. It's not crowding out. So nobody is investing right now, and the capacity utilization is also not quite dismal. So we need the government to step in and say, I'm there. So I think that's very important right now, because controlling fiscal deficit, controlling inflation, it has led to actually slowing down of the economy. We need that animal spirits to come back, and we need the economy, traction in the economy to build up going forward.
Okay, I do also want to talk about what's happening globally versus what's happening in India. How much of global sentiment perhaps at this point is also playing into what we're seeing in India?
It's so interesting. Globally, the synchronized slowdown. But other countries in Asia are growing faster than India. So it's not as if global slowdown has pulled down everybody's growth.
Sure. Okay.
No, in fact, in terms of global slowdown, I think we may be exaggerating at certain points of time, saying that because the global economy is slowing down, India gets affected. I would tend to believe that India is basically a domestic-oriented economy. Most of our growth comes from internally. And in terms of, even though the global economy has not been performing that well, we've had its controversy regarding trade wars, we've had Brexit, all these kind of issues which we tend to play up a lot. If you look at the amount of foreign investment which is coming to India, it's been quite phenomenal on the direct investment side. FPI has also been positive.
Yeah.
And I think the ECB market has been very much open tapped by Indian companies. So I think overall, I think the global environment hasn't really retarded our growth. It's more a case of
I just want to add one thing. If you notice, a lot of foreign people are seeing India, foreign companies, foreign companies are seeing India as the possibility of growth much more than the Indian industrialists. Sure. Indian industrialists are not spending. It's the foreign investors who are coming in. So therefore, the government has to get the Indian industrialists to start spending, as you rightly said.
Okay. Yes, Norway has just launched a big fund, of which 35% has been earmarked for India. So you're right. I mean, that the foreigners, people outside, seem to have more confidence.
One or two things that we must touch upon as we're running out of time on this panel, and that's as far as budgetary allocation is concerned for the MSME sector. The government announcing is going to likely look at a 70% increase versus last year. Critical areas that you think the government must look at, of course, rural spending, rural, consumer demand and sentiment is something that the government has always maintained it wants to look at reviving. But one or two areas that you think the government must definitely look at if it's looking at this kind of budgetary allocation?
No, in fact, I think we are dealing with a budget size of around 27.5 lakh crores. And traditionally, I don't think the overall size is going to increase by more than 10%.
Okay.
And normally what happens is there's a fair amount of allocation across all the sectors. There's been a tendency to spend more on rural, the poor people. And then the second part is the infrastructure part. Yeah? We were talking of roads, railways, urban development to a certain extent. And to my mind, I don't think this configuration is going to change substantially this time. It's going to remain within it. Again, it goes back to what I said in the beginning, saying that are we still going to look at a 3%, 3.5% fiscal deficit? Or what all of us agree going for 4.5%, 5% for 1 year? I think if we're able to do that additional 1%, I think then we can actually talk of substantial and significant additions to certain sectors. Otherwise, we'll be going along the trend path.
Okay.
The outlay will increase, yes, but then along with that, we need to make sure that the transmission takes place. One, there is digitization which happens, so that really it goes down to the last person who's receiving it. And also along with this, a whole lot of judicial reforms to make sure that contracts are the sanctity of contracts is maintained, and money is actually going where it is intended to.
Okay, let's also talk about MSME clusters. That's something that has found mention when it comes to some of the demands that MSMEs are making to the government. MSME clusters and the government, of course, saying that it wants to increase the GDP contribution of small businesses, MSMEs, from 29% right now to 50%. That's in the next 5 years. As we're running out of time on this panel, one or two things that are critical in your mind for that to happen. Open to everyone.
And the clusters is very important, because look at what's happened to the sports goods in Punjab.
Yeah.
Because of the clusters, they've developed so much. So it's very important to have clusters, because all the ecosystem is really supportive of that activity. So I think that should be taken forward. But to go from 29% to 50% just through clusters may not be possible. We need a whole lot of other issues.
Okay.
So in terms of clusters, I think developing clusters for SMEs is a work in progress. Talking of 29 to 50% may be a bit exaggerated.
Okay.
I think it's not going to happen even in 10 years. We should remember that the big growth in GDP comes from big industry. So we need to see large-scale projects, large-scale infrastructure. That's what's going to drive the economy towards a 7.5%, 8% growth. But clusters, SMEs are important because they are very important for exports, employment, contribution to industry. So that's something which I would tend to look at it more as work in progress, where we keep prodding away continuously.
Okay. Journalists love numbers, so I'm going to end this panel by asking each of you to rank the budget in terms of, is this going to be a make or break budget? How practical is this going to be in fixing the issues of the economy, in fixing the issues of small businesses? Let me come to you first.
Look,
On a scale of 1 to 5, if you can.
on a scale of 1 to 5, you call it a make or break. It's not a make or break budget as far as I'm concerned. It's, are you putting the economy back on track?
Yeah.
So I would say the three things I just want to highlight. If they take care of all three, I'll give it 8 out of 10.
Okay.
One is look after the demand side, which they've not looked after. Look after liquidity. And the most important thing is change the perception and fear that exists.
Sure. Okay. Brinda?
I would say the budget needs to really address the slowdown problem, reverse the slowdown, and for this, like I said in the beginning, savings and investment. What are they doing to really push up investment in the economy? How are they getting credit transmission into the system? Because there is liquidity in the system. Banks have liquidity and there's liquidity in the markets, but it's not really going into the hands of the small scale. So I think that is important. And another thing I would say is address the bigger issues, like the four balance sheet problem. So if the budget can do that, and I think the budget is a one-time. You can't just say the budget is a solution for everything. Yeah. So it's difficult to say that this budget must do everything. But if the budget pushes the economy in that direction, I would also give it an 8 out of 10.
Okay.
See, I think there are limitations to what a government can do in the Indian context. We are driven by the private sector, and I think most of the growth takes place from the private sector. And even the central government, I think we tend to obsess over the central government. There's the state governments. I think they have even larger budgets than the central government. And what really happens at the ground level is a lot what happens at the state level, at the municipal level. So I wouldn't overstate the case of the government. I think the role of the state is to have the right policy package, which I think the government has done an excellent job since August. We have actually tackled the problems of individual sectors, and I really can't expect more on the policy front. Now, in terms of this 27 or 30 lakh crores, which we're talking of in the size of the budget, if we're able to deploy a larger part of it towards direct spending in infrastructure, I think that would be a good job done. So in terms of ranking it, I think if we actually have a 3.5% fiscal deficit going to 4.5%, I would say 8 out of 10. Otherwise, maybe around 6 out of 10.
Okay. A rather optimistic note that is then, as we're ending tonight's panel. Thank you to each of you who's joined us here in studio, completely out of time. If you want to get in touch with any of our experts on the panel, or if you have any specific queries you'd like to be addressed in the Budget 2020, do write to us. Our contact details coming up on your screens in just a moment. Thanks for watching. Have a good night.